Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss.
For 40 years, NASA kept certain Challenger documents locked away. In 2022, something changed. New files were released that showed the disaster wasn't an accident, it was preventable. Engineers tried to stop the launch the night before. They begged NASA not to fly. They said people would die. But someone made a phone call that silenced them. That call came from the highest levels. The truth about who gave that order has finally surfaced. What they've been hiding will change everything you thought you knew about January 28, 1986. The Space Shuttle Challenger did not begin its life as a spaceship. It started as a test body in the 1970s, a simple frame called Structural Test Article STA-0999, built only to face stress and vibration trials. Nothing in its early years suggested it would one day carry people into orbit. Then in 1979, NASA made a bold choice. They decided this test craft could become a real orbiter and help grow the shuttle fleet. It got a new purpose, a new identity, and eventually, a new name, Challenger. The name came from a 19th century British exploration ship, HMS Challenger, and it carried that spirit of discovery from the moment work began on it. By July 1982, the rebuilt shuttle arrived at Kennedy Space Center for final preparations. It looked ready, but still needed months of checks, fittings, and tests. Slowly, everything came together. Then, in April 1983, Challenger stood on the pad for its first mission, STS-6. That flight marked the program's first true operational mission. Enterprise had only glided. Columbia had carried the early weight. Now Challenger stepped forward and almost instantly became NASA's workhorse. Between 1983 and 1985, it flew 9 successful times. No other shuttle matched that pace in those years. Each mission carried something meaningful. In 1983, on STS-7, Challenger brought Sally Ride into orbit, and she became America's first woman in space. A few months later, on STS-8, it carried Guy Bluford, making him the first African-American to travel beyond Earth. The shuttle kept building moments like these. In 1984, on STS-41B, astronauts performed the first untethered spacewalks using jetpacks. It looked unreal, yet it was real. Later missions repaired satellites. STS-41C saved the Solar Max satellite. Other missions carried Space Lab modules packed with science. Challenger handled everything. By late 1985, it had flown with the largest crew yet, 8 people on STS-61A, and completed the first night launch and night landing of the entire shuttle program. As 1986 neared, Challenger was being readied for its 10th mission, STS-51L. This was not just another flight. It carried something special that the whole country watched closely. The plan was to send a school teacher into space. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan's administration created the Teacher in Space project to lift public excitement for NASA. The idea drew more than 11,000 applicants from across the nation. From that huge group, a 37-year-old social studies teacher from New Hampshire was chosen, Krista McAuliffe. Her warm personality and her dream of teaching lessons from orbit pulled people in. The media followed her training closely. Every interview, every detail, every smile. The mission had technical goals, too. The crew would deploy a tracking and data relay satellite. They would study Halley's Comet from orbit. But the highlight would have been McAuliffe's classroom broadcasts. Children would watch their teacher speak from space. Through late 1985, Challenger's team prepared for this moment. In December 1985, the shuttle rolled out to Launch Pad 39B, and became the first shuttle ever to use that pad. The original launch date stood at January 22, 1986. But the road to launch grew rough almost at once. The mission before STS-51L, which was STS-61C on Columbia, ran long and delayed Challenger's timeline. Weather problems added more trouble. Launch slipped to January 23rd, then to January 24th, then again to January 25 because emergency landing sites overseas were not safe. When the 25th passed, The team realized they could not reconfigure the shuttle in time for a morning flight, so the date shifted again, this time to January 27. On January 27, the 7 crew members suited up and entered the shuttle. Everything felt close. Everything felt possible. But trouble returned almost the moment they were ready. The hatch had a faulty handle fixture that jammed and would not release. Hours were lost while workers tried to fix it. At one point, they had to saw the part off by hand. When the hatch finally closed, winds at Kennedy's runway became too strong for a safe emergency landing. The crew slept through the night of January 27, 1986, unaware that a quiet storm was building on the ground. While they dreamed about the next morning, engineers at Morton Thiokol were locked in a tense teleconference with NASA, trying to stop something they feared was coming. For almost 10 years, they had worried about one small part of the shuttle's boosters, the O-rings, thin rubber seals meant to keep burning gases from escaping inside the solid rocket boosters. They had raised concerns as far back as 1977, when early tests showed the O-rings were vulnerable. By 1985, the evidence was no longer vague. There had been erosion and blow-by on several missions. Hot gases had slipped past the seals, and the pattern was always the same. The colder the launch, the worse the damage. One man had been warning louder than anyone, Roger Boisjoli. On July 31, 1985, he wrote a memo that felt more like a cry for help. He said the O-ring problem could lead to tragedy. He wrote that it could cause the loss of human life. He said the company needed to act immediately. He talked about the real fear he carried every day. He believed the O-rings could fail completely if things went wrong. Yet by early 1986, the problem still had not been fixed. Flights kept going. Damage kept appearing. And the launch on January 28th was about to happen in a cold no one had ever faced. Forecasts showed an overnight low of 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That was far below the coldest launch in the program's history. Boisjoli and other engineers like Bob Ebeling and Alan McDonald were alarmed. As the evening settled in, they gathered for a teleconference with NASA managers at Kennedy Space Center in Florida and Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. McDonald, who was Thiokol's director at KSC, refused to recommend the launch. He talked about the cold. He talked about ice on the launch pad that might break off and hit the shuttle. He even mentioned the rough seas that could affect booster recovery. But the O-rings were the real danger. Charts and old flight data were shown. The engineers explained that cold turned the rubber stiff. At freezing temperatures, it acted almost like a solid piece instead of a flexible seal. Boisjoli said he was deeply concerned. He explained that if the primary O-ring did not seal in time, the secondary one would likely fail too. He reminded everyone that every cold flight had shown more damage than warm ones. He said they should not ignore the physical evidence. Ebeling was so sure disaster was near that he later admitted he told his wife it was going to blow up. He said he felt God had picked the wrong man for this burden. At first, Thiokol management supported their engineers. At 8:45 in the evening, they told NASA not to launch. This was rare, a contractor asking for a delay only hours before liftoff. NASA's reaction was immediate. The Marshall managers were not happy. Lawrence Malloy snapped back with a line that still echoes today. He said, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April." George Hardy said he was appalled by the engineers' concerns. To NASA, Thiokol seemed to be adding a new rule at the last minute. Do not launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. They had flown 24 missions already. They believed the data was not absolute. They felt the risks were manageable, and they were under heavy pressure to stay on schedule. Challenger had already been delayed several times. Under this pressure, Thiokol's management called for an offline meeting. The engineers were stunned. They had already made their position clear. Now they were told to reconsider. During this private talk, a senior executive named Gerald Mason said it was time to take off their engineering hat and put on their management hat. That line changed everything. Slowly and painfully, the managers shifted their stance. Around 11 at night, they returned to the teleconference. They said the data was inconclusive. They said the cold was a concern, but not proven dangerous enough to stop the launch. NASA accepted this reversal without further pushback. Someone asked if anyone had anything else to add. No one spoke. And just like that, the path was set. But one man refused to sign: Alan McDonald. When NASA asked for a written waiver, Thiokol's leadership left his signature line blank because he refused. McDonald said he could not approve a launch outside the safe limits. He said he would not stand in front of a board of inquiry later and explain why he agreed. He told NASA he hoped nothing would happen, but he would not be the one to approve something he believed the boosters were not qualified for. His words felt heavy in the air. He knew they were taking a terrible risk. Later, physicist Richard Feynman compared NASA's mindset to a deadly game. He said NASA had begun treating near failures as proof of safety. If a seal leaked and the mission still survived, then maybe it was acceptable. He said it was like pulling the trigger in Russian roulette and thinking the gun was safe because it did not fire. The engineers had sensed the danger long before anyone else, and on that cold night in January, they tried to stop it. But the decision moved forward, and the next morning, the world would see the cost. Launch morning began in a cold that did not feel real for Florida. The pad at 39B had frozen through the night. At 1 in the morning, the temperature sat near 26 degrees, and the wind chill cut even lower. Icicles almost 2 feet long hung from the service tower. NASA's ice team kept walking the pad over and over, checking the external tank and all the places where frost had built up. Heaters were running on some equipment, yet big areas stayed frozen. Meteorologists said the low had touched 22 degrees near the ground. Higher up, around the 100-foot level where the solid rocket booster joints were, the air sat around 28 degrees. It was a bad sign, but the schedule kept moving. By 6 in the morning, the crew was waking up and heading to breakfast. They knew it was cold, but they trusted the technical checks. Mission managers met again. Engineers were uneasy about the ice. They feared big chunks might shake loose during liftoff and hit the shuttle's tiles. So the launch was pushed from 9:38 to 11:38, hoping sunlight would clear the pad. At 8:30, the crew suited up. They tried to stay relaxed. They tossed a football in the hallway and then climbed into the shuttle. Scobie and Smith settled in up front. Resnick, Onizuka, and McNair followed. Jarvis and McAuliffe were last inside. The checklists began. Most of the ice had faded in the morning light, but some still clung to the north side of the structure. Even so, the countdown kept rolling. By 11, the final polls were happening. Ice was said to be within limits. Winds were high, but still acceptable. No one brought up the O-ring concern again. It was considered solved the night before. A small sensor glitch had paused the countdown earlier, but that had already been fixed. Houston and Kennedy both gave a go. At exactly 11:38, the shuttle lifted off. The twin booster rockets lit in a huge burst of flame. Challenger rose through a clear sky, and the crowd cheered. In those first moments, everything looked perfect. But cameras caught something tiny at 0.678 seconds after liftoff. A small puff of gray smoke came from the lower joint of the right booster. It was an early warning, but no one saw it in real time. 30 seconds passed as Challenger pushed through max Q, the moment of greatest air pressure. Strong winds shook the shuttle. Later, it would be found that these winds bent the vehicle slightly. At 37 seconds, the weakened booster joint opened again for a split second. A thin spurt of smoke showed up on film. Then soot sealed the gap for a short while. On the ground, the launch looked smooth. The shuttle kept rolling toward the ocean. At 58 seconds, Mission Control radioed the familiar call. Challenger, go at throttle up. Scobie answered, Roger, go at throttle up. It was calm, steady. No one knew those would be the last clear words from the crew. They were climbing to nearly 10 miles high. Maybe they felt some vibration, but they had no way to know what was happening beneath them. At 62 seconds, a small flame shot out from the right booster. The O-ring had failed fully. Superheated gases near 5,000 degrees burst out and hit the external tank. The booster began losing pressure. The tank's hydrogen supply started dropping. The flame grew and cut deeper. 4 seconds later, something odd showed up on a cockpit display. Mike Smith saw it and said, oh, that was all. It was the last known sound from the crew. Down on the cameras, bright flashes showed fuel beginning to ignite around the tank. At 72 seconds, the flame had weakened the strut holding the right booster to the tank. It snapped. The booster swung into the tank like a battering ram. At 73.1 seconds, the aft dome of the tank failed. Liquid hydrogen and oxygen burst out and ignited in a huge fireball. A bright flash spread across the sky. A Y-shaped cloud followed. Challenger was moving near Mach 2 at about 46,000 feet. The forces ripped it apart. Telemetry cut out by 73.618 seconds. Then, silence. The next 3 seconds were chaos in the sky. The two boosters tore away and flew on their own twisted paths. The orbiter's engines shut down instantly as their fuel supply vanished. Pieces of the shuttle scattered. The crowd did not understand at first. Many thought it was stage separation. Others froze in confusion. But then, debris started falling. By 110 seconds, the range safety officer had to destroy the runaway boosters. Explosive charges blew them apart, so they would not hit populated areas. More debris fell into the ocean. Within 2 minutes, the sky held only drifting smoke. People on the ground saw the horror settling in. Challenger was gone. Mission Control went silent. The screens that had always carried clean lines of data suddenly meant nothing. Steve Nesbitt spoke into the broadcast with a voice that tried to stay steady. Flight controllers here are looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously, a major malfunction. It was the plainest sentence for the worst moment NASA had faced. And everyone in the room knew the truth, even before any official words came. After noon, the search began. The area was sealed as boats headed out about 18 miles into the Atlantic. Only scattered pieces floated on the surface. The news went everywhere. The president canceled the State of the Union. People watched the replay on television again and again. The sky, the flash, the smoke pattern, the fall of debris. It all burned itself into memory. Those 73 seconds told a story that took time for the world to understand. The shuttle had not simply exploded, it had come apart. The flame from the right booster cut through the structure like a torch. It burned through the connections that held the tank together. The tank failed as the fuels mixed and ignited. The orbiter's wings came off. The payload bay tore open. The engines separated. The nose was torn free. The famous cloud on television was not the orbiter exploding, but the release and ignition of the propellants. The boosters flew out of the fireball on their own, leaving spirals in the sky. Cameras caught every second of their wild paths until they were destroyed. But the hardest truth came later. The crew did not die in the flash. The cabin remained intact when the orbiter broke apart. NASA found no evidence of a sudden pressure loss at that moment. Some of the crew's personal air packs had been triggered. 3 packs were found switched on. That meant at least 3 astronauts, including Mike Smith, Judith Resnick, and Ellison Onizuka, were conscious long enough to reach for air. They might have felt the cabin shake. They might have heard warnings. They might have tried to act. Soon after, the cabin likely lost pressure. At that altitude, unconsciousness would come in less than half a minute. Then, the cabin fell 12 miles down. When it hit the ocean at more than 200 miles per hour, the force was more than any structure or human body could survive. Dr. Joseph Kerwin's report later said the exact cause of death could not be proven, but all agreed that the crew lived no later than the moment of impact at 11:42 in the morning, about 2 minutes and 45 seconds after the breakup. Inside Mission Control, the voices were low and shaken. When the data disappeared, the flight dynamics officer said the vehicle had exploded. The range safety officer reported a major explosion. A radar tracker said the track was gone. Jay Green whispered, "Oh no," as he watched the trails in the sky. Controllers started saving data. Procedures shifted from launch to contingency. Out at the viewing stands, families waited. Many thought the plume was normal at first, but others knew. A NASA representative told the families quietly that the vehicle was destroyed and there was no hope. A scream rose through the silence. Krista McAuliffe's parents were guided away as the shock hit them. On February 3, 1986, Ronald Reagan called for a blue ribbon panel to uncover the truth behind the Challenger disaster. He put former Secretary of State William Rogers in charge, and soon people began calling it the Rogers Commission. There were 13 members. Neil Armstrong sat there with his calm voice. Chuck Yeager brought the toughness of the test pilot world. General Donald Kutina carried the sharp instincts of the Air Force. Sally Ride and Richard Feynman added the kind of intelligence that could cut through any wall. The mission was simple on paper: find the cause and make sure it never happens again. But there was a quiet message from the White House that Rogers understood. Reagan told him not to embarrass NASA. Rogers himself even talked about NASA's excellent work and seemed ready to protect the agency. Still, as the hearings began, something uncomfortable kept rising to the surface. The commission opened public hearings on February 6th, just 9 days after the crew was lost. NASA leaders stepped in with long, complicated explanations. They talked about SRBs and ETs and dozens of systems that filled the room with technical smoke. Some members nodded politely, some struggled to keep up, and some watched with growing curiosity. As the days passed, the focus narrowed. Everything turned toward the SRB O-rings and the choices made on the night before the launch. By mid-February, the New York Times revealed that NASA had known about O-ring problems for years. It shook the public, but people like Feynman were already pulling at that loose thread. Then came the moment that changed the tone of the entire investigation. NASA officials insisted the launch decision was routine. One senior manager tried to claim that Thiokol had approved everything after talking through a few small concerns. Alan MacDonald was sitting there listening. He was the man who refused to sign the launch authorization. He could not take it anymore. He interrupted the hearing. He told the panel that Thiokol's engineers had recommended against launching and were overruled. The room froze. It felt like a loud crack running down the center of NASA's story. MacDonald had just exposed something huge, and he did it at the risk of his career. He was later demoted for speaking up, and the commission became so angry about it that they pressured Thiokol to restore him. The company only did it after Congress hinted that their NASA contracts could vanish. As the commission dug deeper, they found memos that felt like warnings from the future. One came from Roger Boisjoli. In July 1985, he said that people could die if the O-ring issue was not fixed. Other documents showed blow-by marks from earlier flights, especially the cold launch of STS-51C in 1985, which left charred O-rings. Engineers had tried to raise alarms again and again. Managers kept brushing problems aside. The pattern was becoming impossible to deny. Then came the most famous moment of the hearings. On February 11, 1986, Richard Feynman took a small piece of an O-ring, clamped it, dropped it in ice water, and waited. The cameras kept rolling. People leaned forward. When he took the rubber out, it stayed bent and stiff. He explained in plain words what that meant. The material lost its ability to seal in cold weather. Everyone understood. The room fell silent. His experiment cut through every excuse and every technical fog. It showed, in seconds, what engineers had been trying to say for years. It embarrassed NASA in a way Rogers had hoped to avoid, but it brought the truth to the table. After that moment, the commission could not step back. When the final report came out in June 1986, the findings were clear. The SRB joint seals failed because of the cold. But the deeper issue was NASA's culture. The commission said NASA had flaws in the system. Important safety information got trapped inside the Marshall Space Flight Center. Managers did not pass concerns upward. The launch schedule for 1986 was packed with 15 missions, and pressure to stay on track created a dangerous go fever. After every flight where something went wrong but did not cause disaster, managers grew more comfortable with risk. Feynman compared it to Russian roulette. Just because the last shot didn't kill you does not make the game safe. He warned that NASA ignored clear warnings and treated abnormal damage as acceptable simply because tragedy had not struck yet. Sally Ride quietly helped uncover key evidence. She found an internal NASA chart linking O-ring damage to temperature. She slipped it to General Kutina, who shared it with Feynman. That chart helped prove exactly what cold weather did. The final report did not name one villain, but it criticized the environment created under William Lucas at Marshall. His leadership style discouraged engineers from reporting dangerous problems. He even testified that he thought the launch decision was sound and that he never considered the seals a threat to safety. Rogers had to read back to him a NASA memo warning that O-ring failure could lead to loss of crew. The commission made 9 recommendations. They called for a full redesign of the SRB joints and O-rings. They demanded better communication, a new Office of Safety with independent power, and more realistic launch schedules. NASA accepted the findings. By the time the report came out, several leaders had resigned or been moved. Lucas retired right before the report, but faced harsh criticism in Congress. Someone said his arrogance and smugness helped create the tragedy. Years passed, yet the Challenger story kept growing. Between 2020 and 2025, new details surfaced from archives, documentaries, and old memories that people were finally ready to share. In 2016, Alan MacDonald donated his papers to Chapman University. Boisjoli had done the same earlier. Together, they created an archive of notes, memos, and letters. MacDonald's files contained the original launch forms he refused to sign. Boisjoli's papers showed how deeply he suffered afterward. He wrote about being shunned, ignored, and treated as if he had betrayed colleagues. In one letter, a co-worker told him that if he destroyed Thiokol, his kids would end up on Boisjoli's doorstep. The words felt like a window into how punishing truth-telling can be. Years later, they were honored as heroes, but during that time, they carried their burden alone. A major re-examination came with the 2020 Netflix series Challenger: The Final Flight. It brought new voices forward. For the first time, Lawrence Malloy and William Lucas spoke directly on camera. Malloy looked older and tired. He defended his decisions but carried a heavy expression, like someone who replayed the same night for decades. Lucas, at 98, said he had no regrets. He passed away in 2025 at 102. His comments showed how deeply a certain mindset had shaped NASA. He believed that failures were part of flying, and that you could not avoid them unless you stopped flying altogether. His words shocked many viewers because they sounded so far from what the public believed in the 1980s. The Netflix series also shared new emotional moments. It showed how June Scobie and the families turned their grief into action. They created the Challenger Center, which now teaches students around the world about science and exploration. It was a reminder that sorrow can grow into something meaningful. Then, something unexpected happened in November 2022. A History Channel documentary crew searching for World War II wreckage off Florida found a long buried object under sand. When they sent footage to NASA, experts recognized part of Challenger. It was a 20-foot section of the fuselage, the first major piece found since 1996. NASA confirmed it and said the discovery gave the nation another chance to honor the 7 people who were lost. Most of Challenger's remains stay sealed in a missile silo at Cape Canaveral, but this new finding reminded everyone that time does not fully bury stories like this. In 2024, a new book by Adam Higginbotham added even more detail. He uncovered documents showing that O-ring concerns went back to 1977. One engineer had called the erosion a criticality 1 problem. That meant a single failure could destroy the shuttle. These warnings were basically filed away during the rush to launch the first shuttle in 1981. The book explained how political pressure pushed NASA toward speed and frequency. Every delay looked like weakness. Every flight looked like proof the shuttle was safe. Higginbotham quoted a memo from Marshall that said delaying for O-ring concerns in 1985 would upset the schedule, and that NASA headquarters would not accept that. It became clear that engineers like Boisjoli had been fighting not just a technical problem, but an entire system built to resist them. New revelations also reached into NASA's culture long after Challenger. In 2020 and 2021, the Senate and NASA's Inspector General looked into whether NASA had truly changed. Some employees said dissent was still discouraged. They said they were told not to make waves when raising safety concerns. It showed that the struggle between schedule and safety never fully vanishes. The lessons of Challenger demand constant attention. NASA now has whistleblower protection rules and confidential reporting channels. These efforts exist because of what happened in 1986. Whether they always work is a living question, but their presence shows how deeply Challenger shaped NASA.